Hello, today I've created a complete guide to really smooth and almost cinematic camera movement in Godot. Step by step in this tutorial today, we will create and cover everything you see within this project. These transitions between zones, a slight screen shake effect, and a interaction camera if we interact with our NPC. Here's a breakdown for this tutorial. I know this may seem a bit long, but we will be covering so much information, so if you would like to skip ahead, then feel free to. If you have any questions throughout this tutorial, then drop a comment and I will be sure to help you out. Subscribe to help other aspiring game developers, and well, let's begin. Okay, so now that you made it to the tutorial section of this video, I want to mention that in the description there's a link to an itch.io page in which you can download the before project and the after project. So what that means is what we have right here in our game right now is the before project, right? There's nothing here. It's just a platformer with some icons that create a little world here, and an NPC statue, which is just a sprite 2D, and then a collision shape, which I have hidden so it doesn't overtake our world scene. And the player is a sprite 2D, a collision shape, a camera 2D, and the very basic player movement. And that's all we have in our game, right? So if you want to download this project so you can follow along with this tutorial step by step, then you can download that below. And then if you want to download the finished project, you can also download that so you can go through all the code that we went through today. But that's going to be linked below. So what is the most important thing that we need in our game? Well, that's going to be the Phantom Camera add-on, of course, right? So to add that, we can come up here to our asset library. We can end up right here searching up Phantom Camera. You can already see it's already searched up, but if you search it up here, it should pop up. It should be the only one that is called anywhere near Phantom Camera. Then we can download that and we can install that into our project. After it's installed successfully, we can go back to our 2D scene. We can go up here to our project settings, go to the plugins tab, and we can actually enable that plugin, because if we don't do that, then it's not actually enabled. But once we do that, then we can go over some basics of the Phantom Camera add-on, which of course I want to cover first. So basically, if we play our game, right, we have a camera 2D that's on our player that's basically following our player, which that is okay, right? But if we come over here to our world and we add in that Phantom Camera, and then we click play, and we can actually reposition this. So let's say we want to move the Phantom Camera right here. So like we can see like this section, and we'll be able to see the NPC, right, with this new camera. Let's click F6. Well, it's not going to work. And why is that? Well, also, so basically this square here is the camera 2D on our player, and this square here is that Phantom Camera, right? But so this is like kind of like the viewport of it. But why does that not work? Well, actually for the Phantom Camera node, we have to have a host node. So we have to have a camera 2D and we have to have a Phantom Camera host under that camera 2D for it to even work. So for example, here in the world scene, we need a camera 2D and then we need a camera 2D host. But because the player is part of the world scene, the camera 2D here is basically in the world scene. So we can come to this camera 2D and we can add in that Phantom Camera host. And what the Phantom Camera host is really it's going to use that Phantom Camera that we have in our world scene here to control this camera 2D, if that makes sense. So if we click play, you're going to see that instantly it's going to work, and it's going to show that new camera, that viewport that we created, right? So if we want to move that even farther, like over here, click F6, you're going to see that's what's going to be visible, right? So that's some basics there to the camera 2D, to the Phantom Camera, and that looks good. So let's delete this here. We can remove that. We can click F6, and you're going to see everything works back to normal, and we're just going to leave that Phantom Camera host because, of course, this is the project that we're going to be creating this tutorial within. So what do we need to get started with? Well, first of all, I want to create two nodes, and these two nodes are going to be kind of how we operate the camera. So we're going to create a CameraManager node first, right? We're going to go up here to our world. We're going to add in just a normal node, and we can call this normal node a CameraManager. And the reason we're going to do this is because when you're creating games, you want to make everything modular, and you want to make everything work not based on certain paths, but on export variables, so that you can plug this CameraManager into another scene. For example, if we have world, this is world, if we have world 2 and it's a different layout, we can use this exact same CameraManager to manage all the cameras within that scene as well, right? So that's why we're going to be creating this CameraManager node. We can end up creating a script for this CameraManager node. Make sure we save it into the scripts folder there, create that. And then I also want to add one more thing under our CameraManager, which is going to be a static body. And this is basically going to just act as a folder for the camera nodes that we're going to have within this scene, right? So that looks good. Now, something that's super important, and the way that we're going to kind of go about creating camera movement is by splitting up our world into zones. So if you look at this image right here, this is the editor view of what you saw in the tutorial, right? So you see those different collision shapes there? Those are the separation of zones. For example, this is going to be zone 0, zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, zone 4, right? So we need to create that. And the reason we're going to do that is because if we're here, we want a certain camera to be equipped. And if we move into zone 1, then we want a different camera to be equipped, right? So we want to end up having a transition there in between cameras. But the first thing to even think about doing that is creating a zoning system. So we're going to create something that prints into the output like zone 0, zone 1, zone 0, zone 1, right? So we have something that prints into the output and shows us keeping track of these zones, so then later on we can end up changing the camera based on what zone we're in. So that's basically the main logic. So we're going to create the logic first, which is right now, and then we're going to create the actual camera movement. So to create the logic, we're going to split this up into zones. So inside of our camera nodes folder here, we're going to end up adding in an area 2D, and this area 2D is going to be called whatever our zone is. So for example, this area 2D is going to hold the zone 0 to 1 transition. For example, 0 and then 1, and then we're going to have this area 2D with the collision shape that's right there, if that makes sense. So it's going to make more sense once we actually set it up, because then we'll be able to see it visually. But if we extend this just like this, and we put this right here, you're going to see that this right here is the transition point. So if our player crosses this point, then we want to transition from zone 1, or from 0 to 1. But then if we go back over it, we want to go from 1 to 0. So this is the transition between 0 to 1 and 1 to 0. So we need to basically figure out how we're going to even know that, right? So it's easy to say, okay, well, we can just go, if this goes here and then we go body entered and then send that to our camera manager, it's easy just to say, okay, well, let's change the variable to zone 1 now, but then we can't come back. So we need to create a little toggle, a sort of toggle thing going on, right? And to create this toggle, I want to actually create a function right here, and it's going to have the logic for that toggle, and I'm going to explain exactly how this works. So if we have update current zone, which is going to be a name, right? It's going to be the name of our function, then we can pass through the body, and then we can pass through zone A, and then we can also pass through zone B. Basically, zone A is the zone to the left. For example, let me show you. So we're going to go down into this function now, and then we're going to call this exact function. So how are we going to do this? Well, we're going to say, okay, update current zone. So basically, if we cross through that collision shape, we know, okay, well, we just transitioned into a different zone. So we need to update the current zone. Let's pass through the body that came through that area. Let's pass through the zone A. So zone A is going to be the zone to the left of that collision, and then zone B is going to be the collision, or the zone to the right of that collision, right? Just to keep everything simple. And then we say, okay, well, so update the current zone. We're going to pass through the body that entered the zone. So basically, first thing we need to do is check if that body is equal to the player, right? So we need to create this variable up here. And this is all going to make much more sense once it comes together. But if we say, okay, export var player, or var, export var player is going to equal to a character body 2D, right? And then we can come over here to our camera manager node inspector and assign that to our player. Then basically right here, what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, well, if we enter that zone, if we enter that collision shape, we're going to send a signal to say update the current zone, because we know that we crossed like a boundary, meaning we're moving into a different zone. What zone is on the left of this? 0. What's on the right? 1, right? So then we're going to end up calling that and passing that through. Then we're going to say, okay, well, if the body that entered that collision shape is the player, then we want to switch zones, because if, for example, an enemy crosses that, we don't want to switch the camera. So that's why we're going to do that. I'm also going to create one more variable, which is just going to be the current camera zone, just so we can keep track of it, right? But we started off at 0. And then we can say right here, okay, well, let's match. Let's use the match function. Let's match the current camera zone, because we start at 0. So let's say, okay, well, if the current camera zone, right, basically the camera that is currently active, if that is equal to zone A, then we're going to just change the current camera zone to equal to zone B. And then vice versa, if that current is equal to zone B, and I'm going to explain exactly why this works. So then we can say, okay, well, current camera zone is going to be equal to zone A, right? So let's think about this real quick. So basically, if we cross through this zone, let's say we're here, and we cross through, our player's here in zone 0. We just cross through, and our current zone is zone 0. So what's going to happen? Well, we update it. We say, okay, well, we're moving through the zone 0 to 1 collision. So let's pass through 0 and 1, right? Those are the two that we're deciding on which one we're in. So we're going to send that up here. We're going to say, okay, well, if body equals to player, then that's good. We're going to match zone A or zone B. If zone A matches our current camera zone, then we're going to switch it to zone B, because that means, for example, let's use actual numbers right now. So over here, we're currently in zone 0, right? We're currently in zone 0. So what does our script say? Well, our script says, okay, so if we're currently in zone 0 and our current camera zone is still equal to 0, then we're going to match zone A, because the zone A variable is equal to 0. So if we're still in zone 0, then we're going to end up switching it to zone B, and then we're going to know, okay, well, we're in like 1. So we're going to equal the current camera zone to 1. So current camera is now going to equal 1. Then if we pass back through that going towards the left, we're going to say, okay, well, it's now going to equal to zone B, because zone B is set to 1. So now let's change it back to zone A, if that makes sense. So it's like a toggle. And to kind of see this in game, we can call a update camera function, because we're going to end up creating this update camera function in just a bit, but we can call it now, right? And we can print a statement here, and we can just say something along the lines of camera zone is going to be equal to the current current camera zone. I cannot type, but there we go. And did I put a period there? Okay, that should be good. So if we click play, you're going to see that down here in the output, we have nothing. If we cross through that boundary, we're going to have 1. If we go back, we're going to be at 0, 1, 0, 1. And the real magic is now we don't have to do any code. Watch how easy it is for us to add in a whole different zoning area, right? So that's all the code that we have for zoning. Because if we go up here to camera nodes and we say, okay, well, let's go to area 2D, let's create our next zone transition. So this is going to be zone 1 to 2, right? Let's add in that collision shape, of course. And let's move this collision shape down into the spot where we need it to be. So we'll go right here, right? So if our player crosses through this point, then we want to go to zone 2, right? So we can come up here, send a body entered signal to our CameraManager script. And what we're going to do is we're going to call this exact same function here, right? We're going to call that update current zone. We're going to pass through this body, right? And then we're going to pass through zone 1 and zone 2, because zone 1 is on the left of that collision and zone 2 is on the right of that collision, right? So, but actually, let me clear this up but don't, I'm trying not to confuse you, but we can have this at 2 and we can have this at 1, right? It doesn't really matter because it's going to toggle the same way, right? You just have to make sure if it's transition between zone 1 and 2, you have a 2 and you have a 1 somewhere in this section, right? So I'm doing it like this to keep it, more readable, but you can do that anyway. So if we go to our world and we click play, you're going to see what happens. If we run over here, you're going to see that it says zone 1, camera zone 2, then we're back in camera zone 1, camera zone 2, camera zone 1, and then we can even go back to camera zone 0. So we can we keep track of our camera zones. And I'm going to create one right here, and I'm also going to create one right here. It's going to be very repetitive, so it's the exact same thing. So we can move through these next two a bit quicker because it is the same thing. There's nothing really much to go over here, but zone 2 to 3, right? And then the collision shape, we can set the collision shape to a rectangle. We can bring this collision shape over right here, make it a bit skinnier, rotate it a bit, and then move it right here, right? So basically, if our player jumps off, then we move into zone 3, but only if the player jumps off. Then we can send a body entered to our camera manager, and we can call this exact same function, but instead we can call 2 and 3, right? And then we're going to have one more zone for this project, and we can say, okay, well, area 2D, this will be zone 3 to 4, and then that's going to be a collision shape, of course, and then we can end up adding in a rectangle and moving this down where it needs to be, right? So I hope that this made a bit of sense. So this is just basic zoning. This has nothing to do with any camera movement or anything like that, but we can go body entered, send that to our camera manager, and then we can call that exact same function, but instead this time it's going to be 3 to 4, right? So now if we play our game and we test this out, you're going to see that we're going to have a complete zoning system, and we're going to keep track of zoning here within this current camera zone variable. Basically, we're in zone 0 now. Now we're in zone 1. Now we're in zone 2. Now we're in zone 3. Now we're in zone 4. But we can even go backwards in zones, right? And everything works very, very modular. So that looks good. Now that's our basic zoning system. Now that we have our zoning system, we can actually go into adding cameras to these zones and having custom cameras transition in between these zones, go over camera effects, and go over what this video is actually, meant for. So let's do that now. So this is the boring part, but now we're going to move into the fun part of this tutorial. So camera transitioning and transition effects, right? So what are we going to start off with? Well, we need to start off with how we're going to end up transitioning between like a phantom camera here and a phantom camera here. I'm going to end up keeping this organized by adding in phantom cameras into our zones, right? So we can add in a phantom camera from zone 0 to 1. And then you're going to see that there's going to be a lot of stuff right here. If we try and move it, we're going to end up moving something that we don't want to move. So the way we can do this is by going to our phantom camera, coming down here to transform, changing the position by a little bit so we can end up moving that camera around. And basically we can set up this camera. So you see this rectangle that's moving around with the mouse? That is our phantom camera. That's the viewport that's going to be showing. So maybe we want the zoom, right? Maybe we want to zoom it in a little bit, right? Because I want to kind of create like an illusion. Like we don't know what's beyond this area, so maybe we need more than that, maybe 1.5, right? So of course we want to be able to see the roof, we want to be able to see the wall, the ground, but we don't want to be able to see like this ground here, and we don't want to be able to see that there's an area over here, because we want to leave that until the player jumps off, right? And then end up showing all that, because it's going to leave like a bit more excitement. Because if we click play, you're going to see that the phantom camera is actually going to work, and we're going to have a little zoom in effect, but if we jump down, nothing happens. But you do see that little zoom in effect, and that is called a tween. So if over here we have a tween on load, if we turn that off, of course that's not going to end up going. But you can go and play with all these different animations, and of course we're going to end up playing with all these animations in just a little bit when we start to create our transitions between our two phantom cameras, right? But for example, just keep it simple. If you want to change the duration, that's going to speed it up, and then you have all these different animations or all these different transitions, and these are kind of different ways that the transitions play. So for example, ease in is a very nice one, and then if we have it at like 0.5, that's going to look pretty good in my opinion, and we're going to leave it there because we're not going to really customize anything right now, but we will go over it in just a little bit, right? So that's one camera. That looks good. So if we click play, yeah, we like this. This is where we want to be, right? So this looks like, okay, well, our player can't see the ground, he can't see what's over across the bay, but we are right here, right? That looks good. So if we jump here, then we want to kind of expand the camera and be able to see more of this area and all of this area over here, right? So we can go to zone 1 to 2. We can add in a phantom camera, and this phantom camera here, maybe we can, of course, do the transform tip. So you can offset that a little bit, just like this. And once we have this offset, we can end up changing a zoom here. So maybe we want it to be zoomed in at 2. That's actually a ton. So maybe 1.3. Let's see what 1.3 looks like. Boom. Okay, so that actually looks not bad. Maybe we want to kind of see the entire area over here. So we want to see the roof, we want to see some of this wall, all of this, and then all this ground, and then up to this collision. Because remember, when we hit this collision, we're going to end up transforming into another camera, if that makes sense. So this looks good. And then maybe we can set this to like a sign, because sign is actually my favorite animation in this entire thing. Just if you wanted to keep that in mind, sign is a very, very good transitions. But the thing is, the sad part is we're not going to be able to see that transition because we don't actually have it set up. So basically, when we go into this scene or into zone, so if our player is here, we want this phantom camera to be active, right? But if our player comes into zone 1, then we want this phantom camera to be active, right? The new phantom camera that we just created. So to do that, we can go into our CameraManager script and actually create some variables up here at the start by saying, okay, we'll export var camera, basically the camera for zone 1, right? Or zone 0, sorry. And then set this to phantom camera, right? Because it's going to be an export variable. And how many cameras are we going to have in this game? Well, we actually are going to end up having 5 different cameras. So we can have camera zone 1, camera zone 2, camera zone 3, camera zone 4, just like that. And then we can come over here to our CameraManager script and we can assign these cameras. So basically the zone 1 camera, or zone 0 camera is that one. Zone 1 camera is this one there. So that looks good. We can actually remove this ready function and everything like that because it is just taking up some space. But now we're going to come down here into our update camera function and we can kind of update the camera function. So I want to go over one more thing because it's going to be very, very important as when we create this update camera, because we're going to be messing around with the priority. But the way that the Phantom Camera add-on works is if we go to our 2D scene here, you're going to see that this Phantom Camera is set to 0. This Phantom Camera is set to 0. So it's just going to play one of them, which is going to be the first one that we ended up implementing. But if we go and we set the camera 2 here to 1 priority, right, then you're going to see what happens is we're going to go into that second camera. This is the camera that we created second, right? So this is the one that shows more of the game. But because that priority is high, then if we go to this one and we say, okay, priority equals to 2, then it's going to play that one camera, right? Because we changed that first camera, the zone 0 camera, to a higher priority. So what we have to do is every single time that we want to change the camera, we need to actually reset all the other cameras in the game to equal the priority of 0, so that we can end up matching the current camera zone with the current camera, or I mean with that zone's camera, and then changing the priority of only that camera, if that makes sense. So for example, we can go, okay, well, var cameras equals basically all of our cameras. So for example, camera zone 0, right? So camera zone 0, and then we're going to have all of our cameras variables that we created up at the top right in this exact spot. So camera zone, boom, 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 and one more, right? This will be 4, this will be 3, this will be 2, and this will be 1. Boom. So that's all of our camera variables that we created up here at the top. But because we have these camera variables here that aren't actually set to a camera as of now, we're going to run a for loop and say if camera in cameras, if we're going to, so basically for every camera in camera, we're going to first of all check if that camera is not equal to null. Because if that camera is equal to null and we try and change the priority of a null node, then of course it's not going to work and we're going to get an error. So we can say, well, if the camera is not equal to null, then we can change the camera dot priority to equal to 0, right? So we can basically, what we're going to end up doing is changing all the cameras priority to 0 whenever we call this update camera function. And this update camera function is being called the moment that we switch zones. So instantly, as soon as we switch zones, we're going to end up calling the update camera function, setting every camera's priority to 0, and then right here, changing the camera priority of the one that we want to be active. So we can say, okay, well, current camera zone, and we want to match that with the current camera zone. So basically, if the current camera zone is equal to 0, then we want camera zone 0 dot priority to equal to 1, right? If the camera zone is equal to 1, then we want the camera zone 1 dot priority to equal to 1, right? So basically, we're going to end up having it equal to 1, while every other camera is going to be equal to 0, right? So let's click play. Let's see what happens. If we're here, then we move into here, you're going to see that we do have a transition, and we transition between, and we transition back, which is very, very nice, right? That looks very good. And then this is when you can come over here to the, this is going to be the zone 1 camera that I'm messing with right now. We can end up changing the, for example, the duration. You can change the different thing, like back. Back is actually a cool one, but we're going to not use back for like transitions like this, because it kind of bounces like that, but it is really, really cool. And it is actually a very nice animation that I do like. So that's one of my favorite. And then sign, of course, is one of my favorite. I love the sign animation. It's just so smooth, kind of. It's like a little zoom out, but it looks very, very nice in my opinion. But you can go around and play with all these different settings here. This is just the tween between the transitions. So you can change all that how you would like it. Of course, we have the follow mode up here, which is how we can follow it to our player. But I'm going to go over that once we get to the camera down here in zone 5. So let's create the camera for this zone, the camera for this zone, and then we'll create the camera for this zone next. So we'll go down here to zone 2 to 3, which is going to be basically our zone 2 camera, which this is zone 2, right? So zone 0, zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, zone 4. So this is going to be our zone 2 camera. We can end up doing that little trick here by changing the 100. All right, changing the X position, and then we can move this camera. Maybe we want it to be set to about 1.8. Right, not just 2, because 2 is very, very tight, and then we can set this up like right here. So basically, if we walk and we hit this the collision shape, we're going to end up transitioning into this smaller camera 2D, right? So then how are we going to set up? So now that we have our camera set up here, right? We have our camera set up. How do we go about adding this to our game and having it work, right? Because if we click play, we come over here and we play, you're going to see that it's actually not going to work. We're going to be in zone 3, right? I mean, we're in zone 2 now, but it still doesn't work. So you pause this video and see if you can figure out how to do it, because it's very, very simple. All we have to do is like 2 steps, and then you have it implemented in your game, and every other camera that you add into your game is going to take only 2 steps. So try and do that, and then I'm going to do it and show you how it's done. Okay, so we're going to go up here to our camera manager. We're going to go down here to the camera zone 2, and we're going to assign that camera to that camera zone. Then we're going to go into that script, And then all we have to do is come down here, say, okay, if we're in zone 2, then let's set the camera zone, or the zone 2 camera dot priority to equal to 1. And you're going to see, if we click play, we come over here, that is going to end up work. It's going to work just like that, and we can come back out, back in, and it looks very smooth and very nice in my opinion. I think the actual zoom in is maybe a bit too slow, so maybe we can come over here to our tween and we can end up adding that in a bit quicker, maybe to 0.7, see what that looks like. But yeah, so basically this is just about testing it out and seeing what you end up liking. I like the kind of, maybe the slower actually looks a bit better. I'm not sure, we'll see. Yeah, I don't know, we'll leave it, right? So it's not that important. I don't want to waste too much of your time, but you can go in there and make that look as good as you would like it to. Then we're going to go to the next zone. We're going to end up adding in a phantom camera. And this phantom camera is actually a really cool one because it's not connected to the other phantom camera in any way. For example, we're going to come down here. We're going to change the zoom to 2, right? And then we're going to just set it up like right here so that we can see a little bit of the black on this side, a little bit on the black on the bottom, and then we can see this piece right here so that if our player walks here, then we're going to end up going into that zoom out camera and then following the player. So learning how to follow the player with the camera. But if we do this and maybe we changed everything to, we'll just leave everything how it is, and maybe 1 second looks good. It just depends how fast our player ends up falling down, right? Because we don't want the player to be off the screen. So we can do this. We can go here to our camera manager. We can set this to this zone, and then we can go into our script. Say, okay, if we're in zone 3, then let's say camera zone 3 dot priority to equal to 1. And let me show you the cool thing about this right here. So basically, if we were to have a camera on our player, just following our player, we wouldn't be able to create camera movement like this. And we especially wouldn't be able to create it like this. So if you look at that, it's kind of like the player, you can like, it's clear as day that you can tell that the player's not falling with the camera, but the camera's like almost on a path going down with the player. So it gives the game a really, really cool effect. I don't know if you can see that or not, but it does give the game a really cool effect, and it looks so much better than just having it follow with a camera 2D, if that makes sense. Because just having that camera 2D makes it look a bit cheesy, especially when you're falling down certain paths. So that's one of the main reasons I do like this Phantom Camera add-on. But for example, now we're going to transition into that zone 5, and because we didn't create a collision shape and a transition there, we don't actually have a zone 5 area 2D. So we can add in a new area 2D, call this the zone 5 area, add in that Phantom Camera, and we can set this up how we would like it. So we can come over here. We can even set like limiting just like you can do on a normal camera. So let's set up a limiting for this camera, right? Let's add in a marker 2D. Let's move this marker 2D down here so we can see the position that we want it to stop at. Let's have it stop a little bit below where this camera stops, because remember, it's going to zoom out. So let's go to like 100 or 1115. We can take that Y value. We can remove this marker 2D, and then we can come over here and we can take this phantom camera, of course, change the position a bit, and grab this camera, bring it down here. Honestly, we'll leave it at 1 zoom because that actually looks pretty cool. And then we can say, okay, well, let's limit the bottom left to be, all right, let's limit the bottom there. And then I also want to limit the left. So we can limit the left to a little bit left of this collision. So we can actually take the transform of this collision here, go back to this phantom camera, limit the left here, maybe even go and limit it a bit more. So maybe 700, right? Which looks good. So you're going to see that this camera here is going to end up lagging out somehow. Let's see why. Okay, so we're going to end up getting a big lag out, which I don't know why that is. Okay, so let's see. We want to limit it to the left, right? We want to limit it at 1,500. Let's see what happens. Okay, so now it's working fine. That looks good. So we'll limit it at 1,650 like we had it, right? And then everything is working now, which is fine. So that looks good. And then to make it follow the player, this is the cool part. We can come up here to the follow mode. We can either click glued, simple, group, path, whatever we want. We're just going to click on glued. So we glue it to the player basically, just like that. And then it's going to follow the player around. So you can kind of see that it matched the player already, but it's going to update with the player, but not be visible until we set it to be visible, if that makes sense. So we need to actually go to our camera manager and enable this into the zone 4 camera. I guess this is called zone 4. This is zone 5. So we can actually rename this to zone 4 here. Like that. Have that set up. Go back to this script. Say, okay, now if we're in zone 4, then we can have camera zone 4 dot priority to equal to 1. And you're going to see that this is actually going to give us a really cool effect. But there is something that does happen with this. So you're going to see that if we fall down, that looks good. Then we come here, we're going to end up zooming out. And that looks very, very, very good. So some people, you do get a jitter. We actually did not get a jitter on our player, but sometimes you do get a jitter. And the way to fix that jitter is by going up here to project settings, going to the advanced settings and just typing in FPS here, and then going to run and changing this to 60. So it is already set to 60, but you can kind of see if we turn that off, what's going to happen. And we're going to end up getting a little bit of a jitter. You see that jitter when we fall, and then that jitter right now. You see how bad that looks? So to fix that, you can actually just go up here, project settings, go to that run, and change that 60, that frames per second to 60, just like that. And then there's also one more thing that I want to go over with this last camera here, and I want to add a little damping on it. So if we go to follow parameters, we can add in this damping. And this damping is going to basically allow the camera to like lag behind the player almost. So you saw that we had it was like almost glued to the player exactly, and it was like, it looked kind of stiff. So if we do this and we come into this area, you're going to see that we're going to end up having more of like a movement. You see, once we stop moving, the camera follows for a little bit after. And it looks like it's kind of dragging behind the player a bit, which just gives the camera a little bit of a better feel in my opinion. So that actually looks pretty good. So that's kind of how you set up the cameras. You can obviously go through and change up all these different settings to fit exactly what you need in your project. But there is more that I want to go over here in this tutorial, because that's the transitioning going. But let's create like a screen shake effect. So for example, whenever we fall down here into zone 3, let's create a screen shake effect that we have a little screen shake. So right here, when we fall and we hit the ground, we want to play some sort of screen shake just to give our game a little bit of like a more camera effect feel, right? So let's just add in some more camera effects. To do this, it's actually going to be very, very, very easy. So we can go in here to our CameraManager node. So let's actually make this all done within a function. So we can say, okay, well, function screen shake effect, right? So what do we need to create a screen shake effect? Like, what are we going to need to create a screen shake effect? Well, we're going to need some sort of power. So we can have the shake power. We can pass that through this function. What else are we going to need? We're going to need a duration. How long do we want that screen shake effect to go for? And then we're going to need the camera that we want to turn that, or that we want to affect with that screen shake. So we want to have a camera that we're going to give that effect to. We want to have a duration, which is how long that screen shake is going to last. And then we want to have that shake power, which is going to be the powerful the shake is. So we can have var shake effect is equal to vector 2, and then it's going to be just a random range, right? So we're going to end up pulling a random range from 0 to 1 for the x-axis, and then we're going to end up pulling a random float from the y-axis as well, right? And then we're going to end up multiplying this by the shake power, just like this, which is going to look good. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, well, camera dot global position. So we're going to end up changing the camera's global position based on the shake effect. So camera's global position plus equals the shake effect. And then we can basically, that's going to be our shake effect. But for this to actually work, we need to call it multiple times. So this is going to be one call of that function. But for it to be like a actual shake effect, we need to call it as many times as our duration asks for. So to do that, we can actually put this into a for loop. We can say for I in duration, and then we can call this. And between each shake, maybe we want a tiny little wait, right? So that we can actually have the shake last for a little bit longer instead of it just all happening, you know, within one frame. So we can do something like this, maybe 01, right? So it's a very short timeout, but it is a timeout nonetheless. And then if we click play, you're going to see that, actually we never end up calling that, but let's say when we fall into this zone 3 here, we can call it down here the moment we enter that zone. Then maybe we can say something along the lines of, okay, well, let's await, let's create a timer. And I'm going to tell you why we're going to create a timer. But then let's call that function. So shake effect in this shake effect, we need to pass through our power, we need to pass through our duration, we need to pass through the camera, which is going to be the camera zone 3, right? That's the one that we want the shake effect to happen to, which is the one at the bottom of that fall. And the reason that we have this camera is because our player is going to take about a second to fall. We don't want to play that shake effect before our player hits the ground. We want to play that shake effect after we know for a fact that our player has hit the ground. And we're just going to do it with the timer, so we don't really have to check if the player actually hit the ground or not. But you can kind of see that if we fall, we land, and then that shake effect happens, right? So yeah, you see that we have that shake effect now. That looks pretty good. Boom, we fall, and then after a second of us falling, or starting that fall, after a second of us going through that collision shape, we're going to end up calling that shake effect, right? And then we can end up calling this anywhere. For example, if we want to play that shake effect whenever we enter into zone 1, right, into that first camera zone right here, you're going to see that we're going to be able to, actually we have to throw in a bit of a wait time there, but you're going to see that we're going to be able to play a camera effect basically wherever we want here within the game. You saw that little effect happen there, which is very, very nice, but that's besides the point. So that actually looks good. So this is all you have to do to call that camera shake effect. And honestly, we could end up just adding this wait time here, because it looks like the wait time has to happen almost no matter what. We can throw in that wait time here within this function as well. And then also one more thing that I want to go over just to kind of perfect this screen shake is that whenever we complete a screen shake, we're actually offset the camera from its original position. So you can kind of see that how skinny of a line that this is right here, but in reality, that line is supposed to be thicker, but because we did that camera shake, we end up changing the position of that camera just a little bit. So to fix that, we can come in here to our camera manager, and we can say, okay, well, let's set the OG position of that. Or let's first of all create a variable. Let's save the OG global position of that whatever camera that we're changing. So camera.global position, and then just basically whenever the screen shake effect is over, we can say, okay, well, let's camera.global position. This has to be a vector 2 up here. Camera.global position is going to be equal to the OG global position, right? And then we're going to see that that little issue there should be fixed. And we're going to end up resetting it to the start every single time, or the original position every single time after the animation is over, or after the shake is over. So that looks good. Now I want to move into creating a custom interaction node, so we can come basically over here and walk up to our enemy here and talk to it by clicking the E button and through an interaction camera and controlling all of our different interactions, just like we did here with the camera manager. It's going to be done in the camera manager, but we're going to kind of match it just like we did here with every other interaction. So if you wanted 100 interactions, or if you wanted 1 interaction, it's all going to work the exact same way, and the code is going to be the exact same for everything, right? So let's move into creating custom interactions, and it should be very, very fun. Okay, so to create our little custom interaction zones, we're going to first of all create the interaction zone here. So how are we going to start off with that? Well, we need to create another zone, but we're going to end up adding it under this camera nodes here with an area 2D. And instead of calling it a zone, maybe we can call it a interaction area, right? Interaction area 1. This will be the very first interaction area of our project, so we can do that. Then we can have the collision shape. Now this collision shape isn't going to be like pass through like this. It's going to be more of a box, and if our player is within that box and it clicks the button E, then we say, okay, we want to start that interaction because we're in the area to start it, and we initiated the start. So we can set this up as a little box here, make it something maybe like this size, right? And if the player is standing within this box and the player clicks on the E button, then it's going to start that interaction here with the enemy, right? So boom, that looks good. Once we set up this little box, we're not going to send a signal or anything because we're going to check overlapping bodies once we get into the script, because it's going to be a lot more modular, and I'm going to show you why that is. Because if we come in here to our camera manager, we're first going to create another function. This function is just going to be the input function, right? It's just going to be to get the input. So we can say input event. We're really not even going to need event for this, but we can say if input.is action just pressed, and then the E key, which we're going to have to create, of course. Then what do we want to happen, right? Well, we want to check. some variables, which we don't have created. So we're going to create some variables. The very first variable is going to be a var is the active, or what is the active interaction, right? So var active interaction. So if we have an active interaction, that's going to be equal to the area 2D, which is down here. So if we have interaction area 1, interaction area 2, we're going to equal this to whatever interaction area is the active one. And we're also going to have a boolean, which is going to just check if we do currently have an active interaction, right? And then alpha spawn, that's going to be equal to false. But down here, we can kind of say, okay, if we click E, we need to create some sort of toggle. So we can say, if there is an action, or if there is an active interaction, then we want to just say, okay, well, let's turn the interaction off, right? Let's make the interaction equal false, and then let's update the camera, because we're going to end up having to create a little updated area in the camera script to make sure that there is no active interaction before we play our zone camera. Because if there is an active interaction, then we're going to want to play our interaction camera, right? But we're going to go over that when we get into that in just a second. So if we come up here, then we can say, well, if that's not true and there is no active interaction, then we want to find whatever interaction is happening, right? And this is going to be a function that we have to create here. So why are we going to do it like this? Well, let me explain. So we can get input from anything, from any place of the game. We can get this input even if we are in, not a interaction area. Maybe we're on spawn and we click E. What's going to happen? Nothing. It's going to return null, because we want to check every single area that we have in our game for the interaction. And the way that we're going to do that is, of course, we're going to have some variables up here. We're going to have an export variable for every single interaction area. So basically we have interaction area 1, which is going to be equal to an area 2D, right? And then we're also going to store a value of every single interaction camera. So interaction var interaction 1 or camera 1, which is going to be equal to a phantom camera, right? So we're going to store every single interaction area, and we're going to store every single interaction camera. And then when we get down to this find interaction, we're going to check every interaction area to make sure that the player is overlapping one. And then once we find the area that the player is overlapping with, if remember, because we clicked E, so E was clicked, that means E was clicked and we were in an interaction area, we're going to save whatever interaction area we're currently in as the current interaction. And then down here, when we update the camera, we can match the the interaction camera 1, interaction camera 2, whatever it is, to the current interaction, if that makes sense. So that may have been a little bit confusing, but I promise it'll make so much sense once we get going. So basically, first of all, just like we did down here with the cameras, we're going to run a for statement or a loop, and we're going to check through all of our areas. We're going to say, okay, well, let's grab all of the areas that are in our game. This is going to be an array, and this is going to be, like, for now, it's going to be a bit depressing because we only have one. But let's say you had 2, then you do comma, and then the next one, right? And it would run through all of them. And then we are going to have another var, which is going to be the found interaction area, which is going to be equal to an area 2D off a start, right? When we first call this function. And then we're going to go, okay, well, for area in areas. So basically, we're going to check through every single area in this array. And what we're going to check for in this area is we're going to say, if found interaction area, because as of now our found interaction area is equal to null. So if the found interaction area is equal to null, meaning we don't currently, or we have not found the interaction area, then we're going to go into the check and we're going to check for the interaction area. We're going to say, okay, well, var overlapping bodies is going to basically equal the area that we're currently checking and the get overlapping bodies of the area that we are currently checking, right? Now what do we want to do? Well, now we want to check all of the overlapping bodies of that area that we're checking. So now we can say, well, for I in overlapping bodies, right? If the I is equal to the player that we have, remember, saved up here. If the I is equal to the player, then we can say, okay, well, we found it. We know the player is overlapping with the area that we're currently checking. So then we can say, okay, well, the found interaction area is going to be equal to area. And then we can say, okay, well, is active interaction is going to be equal to true, because now we have an interaction going, and then the active interaction is going to be equal to the found interaction area, right? So basically what that's going to do is stop this for loop, and it's going to set our active interaction here, which we're going to end up accessing from our update camera function in just a minute. And then we can call, basically, if we find a new interaction and we are currently in an interaction, then that means we need to update our camera. So we're going to call that, right? Once we do that, we can go down here into our camera, our update camera area, and we can set everything up. So it's saying that this is not declared because we spelled this wrong right here. But this is going to make so much more sense once we have everything set up. So basically, if we come down here to the update camera, we have the match with camera zones, right? That's good. But what takes priority over the camera zones? If an interaction is happening, we want the interaction to take priority over the camera zones. So we can run an if statement right up here before we start to assign camera zones with priorities, right? We can say if is active interaction, then down here we're going to want to match the active interaction with whatever it may be. So for example, if the active interaction is equal to interaction area 1, then we're going to say the interaction camera 1 dot priority is going to equal to 1, right? And then down here we need to say, well, else if the is active interaction is equal to false, then we can set the camera zones, right? Because we want the zone to happen even whenever. So for example, if we're playing our game and we interact with our player and we're in zone 3, we want zone 3 camera to be active, and then we want the interaction camera to be active, and then we want to go back to zone 3 camera once we undo that interaction. So this script is actually perfectly working, and this is good. But the only thing that we need right now is to set up a little simple camera here in our interaction area. So if we add in a phantom camera into our interaction zone 1, and we set up this camera just like we set up all of the other cameras, right? Maybe we can end up putting a bigger zoom on it, of course, because that's kind of the point, is that we're zooming in onto the player here. So we can maybe zoom in about like this. That looks good. And then maybe we can do, instead of the tween, remember how I said I like the bounce tween? Whenever we get to like something like this, we're going to use the bounce tween, because we're going to be zooming in onto our enemy and onto our player. Onto our NPC and player. And then, of course, we have to go up here to our camera manager, and we have to assign the interaction area 1 to the interaction area, and we have to assign the interaction camera to the interaction area 1 camera, right? And then if we click play, everything should be working. So if we click E, nothing happens. Actually, we're going to have a problem because E does not exist. Yeah, that's what I was thinking that debug meant. But we can go up here, project settings, go to our input map, and we can add a new action E. And we can set that to the E key, just like so. Now, if we were to go and play the game, you're going to see that we can run through our game. We can click E all we want. Nothing happens. We get over here up to our player, try and get in that zone. We click E. It's going to zoom in. All that bounce. That bounce actually looks... Okay, so I actually used the wrong one. I meant to do the back. I think back looks the better. Back is for sure the better one, in my opinion. It just depends on what you're using it for. But if we get into that area and we click E, you're going to see we kind of zoom in, and then we zoom out. Zoom in, zoom out, right? Which actually looks pretty good. So honestly, this looked a little bit like sideways, so maybe we can come a bit like this. But if we turn on debug and we turn on the visible collision shapes, you're gonna see, or actually let's print off a statement, right? So let's go into our camera manager, basically right here, and here in find interaction, we come down here and we print let's see, let's do something along the lines of like, if we don't update the camera, what do we want to print? We want to print something like, okay, if we can't find the interaction, what do we want to happen? So we can say, get overlapping bodies, if I and overlapping bodies is equal to this, whatever it may be, right? We can say print, right, if overlapping bodies, if I is equal to player, right? So if it's equal to player, then we want to print in zone, right? And then if it's not equal to player, which we can't really check, but we can come down here and say else, then we can say print not in zone, and then you're going to see how this works. So basically, if we click E and we're not in the zone, we know, our game knows, okay, we're not in the zone. If we come over here, we click E, not in the zone, not in the zone, not in the zone. But if we get into this interaction area, zone 1 here, and we click it, then it's going to say we're in the zone, right? And so we zoom in, and then we zoom out. Zoom in, zoom out, which looks very, very clean. And that looks good. So we can remove all of this just like so. But we know when we're in the zone and we know when we're not in the zone. And we can run around our map. You can see whenever we cross these boundaries, that's when the camera is changed. We walk in here, we click E, we can zoom in, we click out, and then we can drop down, boom, shake, and we can do the zoom out and the follow the player. And everything looks very, very, very good. So that is kind of a basic little camera introduction here into Godot, how you can create some, more advanced camera movement in your scenes and make your scenes look so much better. I hope this video was able to, shine some light on something, maybe the camera add-on that we are showcasing today, the Phantom camera. I think it is one of the best add-ons in all of Godot, and I stand by that. So go check it out, and I hope this video was able to help you in some way. Remember, if you have any questions at all, please let me know in the comments. I would love to help you out. And you can, of course, join the Discord link below, and you can DM me on there, talk in the chat, and I will for sure talk back and respond and help you out in any problems Godot related that you may have. So reach out to me if you need any help at all. Please subscribe to help other aspiring game developers. It means the absolute world to me, and I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day and stay safe. And I hope you learned so much today. But until next time, stay safe, and y'all have an amazing rest of your day. Bye bye.